Hey, everybody, welcome to our latest episode of our Tick Bootcamp podcast. I'm here today with my special guest co host, Candace Matthis from Two Alpha Gals. And we have a really special guest today, Nick Perfumo, who's going to share his journey not only with alpha gal syndrome, but Lyme disease and his battle with mast cell activation syndrome as well, and how he's working to overcome all of these things and regain health. So I'm going to hand it over to Candace to say hello and kick off this podcast interview.
Hi, everybody. And thank you, Nick, for being with us here today and being willing to share your story. So can we take it all the way back to your childhood? Can you share with us what your life was like as a child before, you got your diagnosis of these various tick-borne diseases and mast cell?
Thanks for having me on. Going back to my childhood, I grew up in Central Florida in a small town, DeBary, Florida, and I had a pretty fun childhood. Always playing in the woods, playing outside. We had a lot of retention ponds in our neighborhood, so me and the neighborhood kids would love going through there and playing all sorts in this overgrown retention ponds throughout the neighborhood. We'd all meet up at friends' houses and to go to the different retention ponds where we cut trails and just had fun boy things to do, throwing pine cones at each other and things like that. So as you can imagine, there were a few tick bites. I don't really recall too many as a young kid, but it definitely had a couple here and there. And
Okay.
that was pretty much how my childhood was in Central Florida.
So you mentioned tick bites as a kid, and I know one of the questions that we were asked by Matt and Rich was if we remembered having any tick bite prevention in schools or any education from our parents. I did not. And I wonder, did you have any of that growing up, being that you were outdoors a lot?
Not at all. We didn't have any really prevention in school or in the family. My family's from Florida, and there's ticks obviously here, but I guess we never really had any of that tick prevention training or knowledge growing up.
Okay, so then, if you receive these bites as a kid, were you sick at all during that time? Do you remember?
So I always had what was at the time just bad allergies, constant sinus infections, constant strep throat, um, pretty much 2 or 3 times a year until my later in my life, in my 20s, which listening to tick boot camp, it seems to be a common occurrence, reoccurring thing between people getting bit by ticks at a young age and they kind of just become sickly. And that's definitely how I feel looking back. Wish I would have known what you guys are preaching this whole time, but yeah.
I know it's hard when you're younger and you don't have, that education base, I guess, around tick-borne diseases. It wasn't what it is, now back in the 80s. Like I don't remember any of that either. So you mentioned that things started to kind of pick up as far as symptoms go in your 20s. Can you kind of give us more of a picture of what that looked like for you at that time?
Yeah, to kind of go back a little further, I've in my youth, young childhood, I always had a kind of an intolerance to beef. That was the one thing that kind of stuck out. I always got GI upset with beef, eating beef tacos, hamburgers, all that stuff. I mean, I never went out of my way to avoid it, but I definitely had some GI upset from that. And then later in my 20s, um, especially around when my wife and I first got married, it started to develop what now is MCAS MCAS issues, and I had a spontaneous reaction to perfume. So my wife was wearing the same perfume, and then all of a sudden, 3 months, 4 months later, I was going anaphylactic. My throat was closing up, and every time she got in the car, I'd have to like pull over off the side of the road just to catch my breath. Um, and yeah, that was a really odd thing. And then spontaneous reaction to wool right around the same time. So I'd wear like a wool jacket or anything touching my skin, I just start itching uncontrollably. So it was definitely looking back, so that must have been Alpha Gal as far as the wool allergy, and possibly the MCAS along with that. And also I had a lot more GI upset. And I narrowed it down to red meat, and we pretty much cut out red meat out of our diet. But the things that would really, I guess, confuse me about symptoms was just fried food. I would take one bite of fried food, and all of a sudden I'd be like, "Oh, this is the oil that I cannot tolerate," because it would just not knowing at first, it would just lock up my stomach. I didn't take anything in. Not, I couldn't even drink water. Like it would get pretty bad with some GI upset from there.
So okay, so we're going to talk about alpha gal for a minute because now I'm completely curious. As a kid, were you a teenager, I guess, at that time when you started having that beef intolerance?
So even younger than that. So I was probably around 8 to 10 years old when I started having that beef intolerance, at least noticing that it was beef related,
Okay.
somewhere around that young age.
So we know the varying degrees of symptoms and reactivity with alpha gal. Even among Debbie and I, our symptoms can be very different. Has the GI part of that, has it changed in any way over the years? Do you have other symptoms along with that, or do you just experience more of the GI variant of alpha gal?
Um, so I would say I mainly had the GI variant for gal up until I guess more recently, around 2020, 2021 time frame. I started going anaphylactic. It was my first anaphylactic event, which was really scary. And I would get itchiness, hives all around my throat area, basically on my body, and just get extremely itchy on my legs, hands, just everywhere. Um, but that didn't start to occur until later in my life, in my mid 30s.
Nick, I want to ask a question because it's really hard, I think, for Lyme patients to decipher what might just be food intolerances due to Lyme disease versus alpha gal syndrome. Because when I first got sick with Lyme disease, I had a ton of food intolerances that I never had before in my life, but I never tested positive for alpha gal, and I never had issues with red meat or wool or things like that. But I also did have some MCAS, mast cell activation syndrome inflammation problems that were associated to Lyme. So it's hard for me as there's so much overlap, but alpha gal is, really a thing on its own as well. So how would you describe the symptoms you were having and sort of make it stand out, separate and distinct from potential Lyme food sensitivities? Because I always have a hard time identifying, like, could this be alpha gal or could this just be something from Lyme disease and not alpha gal? Do you know what I mean?
I think that really poses a great question, and I wish there were more clear answers. I think both with Lyme and alpha gal, I wish we had more clear answers because there isn't. And yeah, to distinguish, you know, alpha gal or this, I mean, I think that's the hardest thing about alpha gal and Lyme disease, food intolerance, is we don't really know what caused our reaction. Um, and especially with the delay onset from alpha gal, it's so hard to pinpoint, what's actually causing it. What is my trigger this time? Yeah, of course we know that it's mammal derived ingredients, but we don't exactly know what it was that caused the issue. I mean, there's so much hidden byproducts and things in um, foods that it's just so hard to pinpoint.
Yeah, I just wonder though, right? Because you mentioned that at a young age you had the red meat allergy, and it was more minor, meaning it was just inconvenient, but then it became really bad and debilitating in your 20s. But I'm going to I know from chatting with you offline that you met your now wife when you were in high school, and you got married, and you were doing a ton of hiking in your early 20s, and you got bit by ticks all the time when you were hiking. So I wonder, do you think you were bit and infected with alpha gal at a young age, and you had more minimal responses to red meat, and you think you got reinfected again? Or, do you believe that you just became more sensitive over time to the alpha gal allergy that you picked up at a younger age, right? It's really an interesting question. I'm curious what your doctors think on that as well.
My doctors are kind of the same, I guess, perception as I do. I mean, I feel like I so I hypothesize, especially since my family, my three cousins also have chronic Lyme disease. And I believe that I probably contracted it similar time as they did on my grandfather's property when we were growing up. Um, and I kind of wonder whether it was alpha gal during that period of time, or was that like what you're kind of suggesting, that it was more Lyme based food sensitivities or intolerances at that time. And then as I got bit by more ticks in the Tallahassee area, I believe I did contract alpha gal during that 2010 timeframe, and with more tick bites and more tick bites, it just kept getting worse and worse as far as the alpha gal went. And I think they were kind of playing hand in hand together on wreaking havoc on my system.
So I want to circle back to something that Matt, you were just talking about, because I think it's important maybe to mention that, because there is such confusion, I think a lot of times, is it Lyme? Is it a food intolerance? Is it mast cell? Is it alpha gal? I think it's so important just for our listeners out there, if you're struggling with any of this, just get the alpha gal test. I think it's so helpful to just get that blood test to rule it out, and then what you're dealing with, at least from that standpoint, because there is such an overlap, and we deal with this too. I also have dealt with mast cell issues, and it can get super, super frustrating. So Nick, I'd love to know, like, when were you actually formally diagnosed? Can you kind of take us through that? Like, what kind of practitioner did you see, and when did you receive these various diagnoses?
So in 2021, I was over at a friend's house in North Carolina, and we had a barbecue. We ate ribs, potato salad, the typical barbecue stuff, and it was perfectly fine. And all of a sudden that night, I went anaphylactic. Uh, I just thought I was okay. I must have had food poisoning. I remember, well, I'm going to sleep in the separate bedroom from my wife. I don't feel good. And remember just going, you know, had severe diarrhea, and then it progressed from there. And I started getting itchy head to toe. I mean, an itch that was unlike anything I've ever felt. Hives all over the place, and throat closing up, and it was scary. So I knew I had to get tested finally. I mean, my family always kind of joked, since I had that beef intolerance, like, we'd see an article here and there, they send it to me, oh, you need to get checked, this and that. I'm like, I'm fine. I don't think it was that bad. Just with the GI upset stuff. I get a little gassy after eating beef, and bloating and all that stuff. It's not like I'm fine. It's okay. But then I went anaphylactic, and I went and saw an allergist. Um, and they confirmed that, ran a blood test, and they only really checked for alpha gal at the time. That was my main request. I basically demanded that I get tested for it, and it came back positive. And that's how I started, I guess, my self treatment, just with the diet. And I still wasn't quite getting better. My GI symptoms and really all my stomach issues really went away, but the rest of the Lyme symptoms, or I'd say more tick-borne disease symptoms, just didn't really get too much better. So I went to, do you want me to continue with the doctor stuff, or you want me to stop there as far as the alpha gal diagnosis?
Matt?
Well, I just have so many questions. So,
Yeah.
Nick, if I want to tie this back to what's going on in your life personally as well, because all this is, it ties together. So the first question I have for you is, despite all of your symptoms and getting worse in your 20s, you met your wife, you got married, and I believe by the time you were 22, you had your first child, correct? Or no, am I mistaken with that?
No, we had our first son in 2017. So,
Okay.
yeah, going back, I don't know how old I was at that point, 29, 28.
Okay, so later 20s.
Yeah.
So also, what were you doing for work? Because I know that plays a role into some of your willingness to want to get tested or not as well, right?
Yes, absolutely. So for the about the past 16 years, I've was working as an air traffic controller, which is we had a very strict, very stringent medical clearance. I mean, so much so when I first got hired, basically controllers were getting fired for taking Zyrtec, um, which sounds absurd. But they basically, that was a do not take drug, and if you've ever taken it before in your life, basically you weren't getting hired or you weren't, and people will lost their jobs or put on medical, basically unable to perform that job just due to their medical clearance. So absolutely, I was not. I basically was hiding my symptoms as best as I could, and when I would go see my primary care physician, say, "Hey, I just don't feel well. This doesn't feel right. Can you test me for anything? But whatever you do, don't put it in writing because then I have to report it." And that was it's basically shooting myself in the foot looking back on it. But it was a career decision at the time. So it's do I want to keep my job or not? And that's basically a decision I made at the time until it progressed worse and worse as I got older.
Yes, I think if you don't mind, Nick, just going into now, you're going to the doctor, you get diagnosed, and definitely continue on that path if you don't mind, and talking that through with Candace.
Yeah, so I got my alpha gal diagnosis, and I started I did an elimination diet at the time, and I went complete, cut out every single mammal product that I could, and my GI symptoms really cleared up, and that made a big improvement, even with my joint pain and that those issues as well. It really helped some of that inflammation come down, but it was still my brain fog and fatigue issues just didn't really subside. Um, so I scheduled an appointment with a integrative health doctor and finally made the decision to, okay, I need help. I need to get something done. Um, Started having heart palpitations around that same time as well. And that was really scary for me. And made an appointment with Dr. Commons, which was the leading alpha gal syndrome researcher, since he was only about an hour away from me, which was very convenient. And also made an appointment for a Lyme specialist for the integrative health, which I found on, I believe, is the iLads website or Lyme disease advocacy website. I found them, this practitioner from there, and basically I had those appointments back to back. Okay, like if Dr. Commons can't help me, then maybe this Lyme specialist can. And yeah, I remember talking with Dr. Commons and felt good to get validated on some of the issues. But I remember one of my symptoms, and I don't recall what it was, but basically he kind of stopped writing his notes and kind of looked up at me. I was like, "That's not normal, is it? That you normally hear?" He's like, "No, no, okay. Well, I know there's more going on." Um, and then I believe it was the next day. I think I had my appointment with the integrative health specialist, and I thought, having Dr. Commons and being validated and heard was good, but the Lyme specialist, the Lyme literate doctor was on a different level. They were just so much more understanding than even, alpha gal specialist. It was, yeah, and I tried not to tear up a little bit because it was like, it was a weird feeling. But that's when I started really going through the Lyme disease treatment and testing, and yeah, it really began the journey for the Lyme disease treatment issues.
Okay, can you share with us like a little bit about what treatment that you actually went through? I know there's so many various treatments, but what did you find to be the most helpful for you?
Feel like I'm still so early in that journey because I've only seen them for about a year and a half at this point. And I have to constantly remind myself, my wife constantly reminds me as well that no, you're so much better than what you were. And I think it's just a slow, gradual process that it's hard for me to realize, the improvements that I have made. But I it was initially started on it's called DesBio protocol, which is a herbal. Um, and I finished that one, and it helped a little bit, maybe 5-10%, which is good.
Nick, can I
Um,
interrupt you? I apologize for interrupting.
yeah,
I want to just focus on that piece because we've had several people on this podcast use DesBio in a variety of ways. And, some had success, some didn't have success, some got worse. So I was wondering, though, how long were you on it for? And if it did help, what symptoms specifically did it help you with?
so there's basically 3 boxes of tinctures, or the first round, I believe it was 3 boxes of tinctures for 3 months, I think it was. It's hard for me to remember these. And then you move into the 2 different stages, or three different separate stages of DesBio protocol, if I'm remembering this correctly. The first box is you have to do that for three months, or 3 boxes, and then you move into the second box, and then the third. Um, and what I noticed the improvement was more of my speech. I felt like I was like slurring my words, and it was just hard for me to talk. And that was the biggest improvement that I noticed during that process, that um, procedure, the DesBio protocol.
So I also want to ask you, because it's very interesting that you had now a diagnosis of Lyme disease and alpha gal, because many doctors say, I mean, I've had doctors say this to me, the deer tick generally is how you get Lyme disease here in the Northeast, and the Lone Star tick is how you get alpha gal syndrome here in the Northeast. But if you're sick with alpha gal, they're not thinking Lyme because it's a different tick that generally is known to spread Lyme compared to alpha gal, right? And my question is, was this surprising to your doctors? Because either A, it meant that we're wrong and you got infected, with both from the same tick, or B, that you're just bit by so many ticks that you got bit by a deer tick or some other tick and got Lyme disease, and maybe a Lone Star tick and got alpha gal. But it could be more common than we think, because here we are on a podcast with you who now has alpha gal syndrome and Lyme disease.
Right. My doctor believes that just because of how many tick bites that I've had, it's so hard to distinguish, which is which. And yeah, I mean, I personally couldn't tell you, yeah, I was bitten, 1,000 times by, a Lone Star tick. I couldn't tell you, being tick illiterate, I never saved ticks. I didn't care what type it was. I never even looked at what type it was. I just pulled them off and kept on going. Um, and that was, to disadvantage myself now, not knowing what it was, what it could have carried, and all that. Yeah.
So I also like to find out tips and tricks for people that are listening to this podcast, because you had all these crazy allergy symptoms, you had the anaphylaxis, you got diagnosed with alpha gal with your local doctor, you pulled off, you did basically an elimination diet, and you started to feel better, but not normal again, right? You had some symptom relief, but you had all these other weird symptoms. You then see Dr. Commons, he is the leader with alpha gal, and a lot of things you said made sense, and some of the things you said sort of raised an eyebrow, like that doesn't seem consistent with alpha gal syndrome. So I guess my question to you is, do you think that the experience of people who are going to get alpha gal syndrome diagnoses and they're running into walls, they should consider a Lyme literate doctor as well, because there's so much overlap, right? And I think sometimes you get into our little silos of I have Lyme disease, so it can't be alpha gal, or I have alpha gal, so maybe I don't have Lyme disease. But in many cases like yours, there's an overlap there. And whether it's food sensitivities from Lyme, or whether it's alpha gal and a legit allergy against the alpha gal protein, we need to be more broad in our approach to getting help if we're not feeling better with whatever practitioner we're seeing, right? And that's the general thing I think I'm seeing here from your story so far.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think the Lyme literate doctors, I think they look past even Lyme disease. So I think they really understand that what's going on is more than just one thing. And I think that in itself helps so much, just to be validated, and just to be heard on those all your symptoms and all my symptoms, and just, yeah, just to be heard and understood by a doctor that knows tick-borne disease, and not just, and understand that it's not just one thing that's going on.
Yeah, and I think it's so huge. I mean, we talk about this on our podcast at Two Alpha Gals, just the importance of our mental health, and nurturing that. And I think when you get your team, the right team together that's validating you, it can help you heal. It starts kind of that process. I'm curious, just from a Lyme perspective, did you receive a clinical diagnosis with Lyme disease, or did you test positive with, the blood work that's done?
Well, I tested negative for Lyme disease. I basically took every Lyme disease test, and also a DNA test. Um, so I forget the names of them right now. Western blot. I know there's another blood test, and I tested negative on that. And then I did a DNA connections, a Lyme test, and that was also a negative. I came back with one other co-infection. Um, but yeah, just given I've had Rocky Mountain spotted fever, tick-borne relapsing fever, and alpha gal, and I was clinically diagnosed with Lyme disease given my symptoms and what was going on.
Man, I think that is typically how it goes, because it seems like those tests are just not super accurate. Um, so with your MCAS, how has all of that been since you've been starting on this protocol? Has it calmed down a little bit, or what has your experience been on that front?
So with the MCAS, I didn't realize what all was impacted, what was actually happening. So I started to realize I am fume reactive to alpha gal. So for everyone that's not familiar, it's basically if someone's cooking food or cooking things with mammal products in it, yeah, my throat would start to close up. Basically, have to be constantly clearing my throat, just trying to keep my airway open. And that was happening a lot at work because the kitchen was right outside of the operations room, and it was getting difficult at work, with that going on. But with the protocols that I'm currently on, which is the Cowden, and just some herbal treatments, I mean, my MCAS seems to be very up and down now. It kind of goes back to what my baseline used to be, but then there's days where things don't affect me that much. Perfumes don't affect me as much anymore. So, hopefully you taking that roller coaster up where it's just up and down, and hopefully things are getting better. Like I said, I feel like I'm very early in my treatment, and I'm just trying to be positive and, keep thinking, okay, well, at least I didn't have a reaction to that perfume, or, I can actually go outside or go through a store and not, have to run away.
Oh, I can so relate with you.
Yeah.
And it's so nice when you can get to that point, and I hope it just continues to improve for you. So, as you're talking about, like, you were basically having anaphylactic reactions at work then. How long did you endure that?
About 2 years, 2.5 years of that. Yeah, I probably longer than that, but honestly, I realized what was happening, especially with the fume reactivity. I had no idea that it was happening, but it was just constantly clearing my throat, where I couldn't quite get it free, and I wasn't nothing else in my environment was changing, and it was at times it was getting kind of difficult. But I had honestly I didn't put two and two together, and I never talked to a doctor about it either. So shooting myself in the foot.
Well, and I think
Luckily,
there's a
nothing
lot.
happened.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot, of misinformation maybe out there about anaphylaxis, of what that really looks like. I think it's just portrayed as, in the movies and stuff, people are swollen, their eyes are swollen shut, they have hives, it just doesn't always present that way. I was the same. It took me a long time to realize that. Do you have an EpiPen now and like a emergency plan?
I'm still, for being in that job for 16 years, and I am still like very fearful of, sounds bad, but I'm very fearful of using, an EpiPen, because I know if I used it, I would have to report it, and it would be a huge mess to try to get back my medical clearance. I'm no longer in that position. I've stepped away from air traffic, um, but I'm still, it's a hard thing to get out of your head. If you've been that way for, your last 15, 16 years of trying to hiding your, what's going on. But yeah, absolutely. I carry an EpiPen in my pocket all the time now, and other drugs, Zyrtec if I'm traveling, but typically Allegra, Pepsid, and all those emergency medications that you take right at the beginning of a symptom. Because once again, you never know when it's going to happen or where, because we don't even know what's in the food that we eat.
Yeah, no, and it's so smart. I mean, you have to be prepared. I'm so glad that you were okay in those 2 years, because, that's really, really hard. Matt, do you want to, sorry, do you
I
want me
do. I'm trying to be, I'm learning so much from you guys. But some of the questions I have for you, Nick, and I'm just fascinated by Alpha Gal, and I'm almost ashamed to admit I don't know more, which is why I'm so happy to have Candace as a friend and now you, Nick, because I'm learning from you guys. Which is, you mentioned earlier that you're starting to get better and you're becoming less responsive to, fumes and things in the air and certain foods. Do you think that the treatment you're doing for Lyme disease is having a positive impact on your alpha-gal syndrome and making you less reactive?
That's speculation, absolutely. And whether it's just the diet change, lifestyle change, air traffic control is one of the most stressful jobs you can do. It used to be always in the top 10 most stressful positions, and the sleep schedule is the worst thing known to man. I mean, I can't believe that it's one still going on, um, even to this day with everything that's going on in the news with air traffic. But I mean, but my sleep pattern has improved drastically since I've stepped away, and the lower stress. Yeah, I think everything combined with the protocols, with the treatment from my Lyme letter doctor, I think all of that combined is what is kind of pushing me towards improvement.
It's interesting because we often hear that there's no cure for alpha gal and you have to live with it and there's nothing you can do. But I think what I'm hearing from you is, look, we don't have enough research, we don't have enough science, and it's constantly evolving. But there are things we can do to help ourselves, whether it be lifestyle, whether it be treatments, whether it be just strengthening our immune system or whatever that has seemed to help you. So that gives me hope that we're going to be able to find better tools for people with alpha gal in the future. But another thing I want to ask you about, Nick, was you mentioned earlier, and I know you talked about it in your pre-interview questionnaire, that you believe and your doctors believe that maybe you weren't testing positive for Lyme, despite having Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and I think it was a tick-borne relapsing fever and alpha gal syndrome, because you were very active and very athletic. And that because you were such an active person, that maybe that caused a problem with the testing. So can you speak to that a little bit? Because that stuck out for me for people that are struggling with the diagnosis as well.
Yeah, one of the other issues was that maybe I didn't exercise enough prior to doing the DNA test, which I know that can be an issue and part of the reason why even the DNA tests aren't always accurate. But I've a doctor had mentioned that before, and I've heard you guys speak about that as well, as far as more active people, just they don't test positive. So they basically, I don't really know a whole lot about it, but that's just what I was, told and learned from you guys as well.
Yeah.
Told by my doctor and learned from you guys.
Yeah, we hear it often, and it's just a common theme that we've been hearing from other doctors and other patients. And I just wonder if it means, you're doing all you can to be healthy and your body's fighting it off. And the Lyme bacteria itself is in such low concentrations in our blood that the more you're fighting it by exercise and lifestyle changes and good diet, there's even less of it to be responsive to during a blood test, right? So I'm anecdotally making that observation. Could be false, could be true, right? But it's a pattern we've seen. So the other part is, that I really want to talk to you about is you've done some other things to treat. In addition to DesBio, you also did low dose naltrexone as well. So can you speak to your experience with that?
Yeah, so that to me was the single biggest improvement that I have felt was starting the low dose naltrexone or Narcan. And basically, I mean, once again, most of these treatments don't really notice the improvement until later because I think it's just small improvements. But when I remember I was on LDN, low dose naltrexone for about 90 days, and I didn't renew my prescription in time. So I was off of it for like a week, and it's like the inflammation just came back with a vengeance, and it's just wow, okay, this stuff is actually working. And that was the single biggest thing that I realized that how much it was helping. But it was the inflammation part of it. My joints felt it, they weren't in constant pain all the time anymore. I mean, they were in, I guess I should say they weren't in severe pain anymore. I didn't have wake up and I couldn't walk for, 15, 20 minutes until my joints kind of loosened up and things like that. So that was, to me, that was the single best um, treatment that I've been on so far.
Nick, were you with the same doctor all along? So you went to this doctor, you went to ILADS, International Lyme and Associated Disease Society. You found their directory probably sounds like to find a Lyme literate doctor, and you found your first doctor who did DesBio. Was that the doctor that prescribed you low dose naltrexone? And did you see any other Lyme doctors throughout the last year plus of treating?
I've been with the same doctor, the same practitioner this for the last about a year and a half, maybe 2 years, and been on that treatment plan with them. So they've suggested a lot of the other treatments that I hear on your show. I just haven't, I guess, don't really have the time, or I don't mentally, I'm not prepared to do them. So I struggle to believe like how much it'll help, and if I'm in that state of mind, I don't feel like I'm ready to try it. The ozone therapy and things like that, I'm just not ready to try those yet mentally. So, um, but yeah, that I've been with them the whole time.
So what other things have you done? Because I know from just chatting a little bit offline, and again, your questionnaire, Japanese knotweed is a very common herb people use, and it looks like you used it. And I guess the product you use, I'm gonna Boba BB VII. Is that what it's called?
Boba BB VII. It was a Japanese knotweed treatment. That was the first thing that I started on um, before the DesBio. And I actually had a really bad Herxheimer reaction from that. And then I started into the DesBio. And outside of that, we went down hormone therapy, basically testosterone injections, which helped, I guess, slightly. Honestly, I didn't feel a whole lot. I was expecting that to be like the golden ticket to change my fatigue around, and it didn't. I mean, it's helped, it's improved, but that wasn't the golden ticket. I don't think there is any such thing in Lyme disease or alpha gal or any tick-borne disease. Um, yeah, and so the Japanese knotweed, DesBio, and basically just vitamins, supplements, vitamin D, vitamin C, um, and I believe that was pretty much my whole kit from the start. Was those four things, five things.
You talked about the herxing, right, from the Japanese knotweed, which makes sense because it's a pretty strong antimicrobial. But one of the things that we often hear when people have mast cell activation syndrome and they have this histamine intolerance, they often have to start with a lower dose of treatment because they herx way more than people who don't have MCAS. So do you think that's something you experienced? Because it sounds like you had it pretty early on, and then you went on to the DesBio. So is that a consideration? And do you think that it was a harder balance for you with the Herx reaction and the detox reaction because of your MCAS and also the alpha gal, right? The alpha gal itself is making you more, inflamed.
Yeah, I think that all it all plays into a role into healing and treatments. Um, yeah, later on, after the DesBio, we tried Methylene Blue, which is supposed to be great for the brain fog issues that us Lyme people. Um, I hope no one takes offense to calling us Lyme people, but yeah, it's supposed to really help with the brain fog. And I I wonder if it's MCAS or Alpha Gal, but I could not tolerate it at all. Basically, an hour and a half after taking my dosage, I would just be incredibly inflamed and felt sick to my stomach, and which led me to calling the manufacturer. Okay, well, what's going in this? It's like, oh, it's just water and this dye. Okay, well, what's your filtering process? And basically just couldn't get a clear answer from anyone, even the people that manufacture it. So I'm not really sure what caused that, whether it's MCAS or alpha gal or anything like that. But it's definitely hard thing to know once again what's causing my reaction, and that's always the question. And very rarely do we get a clear answer.
So Nick, as you were talking, I was immediately wondering, and then you brought up manufacturing and the questions that we kind of have to do, this deep dive as alpha gal patients. Did you research, or did your practitioner research the treatments prior to seeing if they were alpha gal safe? I mean, especially for those that are, alpha gal out there listening, do you know if they have any mammal containing products?
Yeah. So this practitioner really blew my mind. They put me on all these the supplements and some of the drugs. They're like, oh, well, we called our pharmacy downstairs, our dispensary downstairs, and there's no mammal in it. I'm like, you called it? What? So it really surprised me. Now I with like the methylene blue situation that they gave me, I still call the manufacturers. That I don't think they go to those extremes, because okay, well, look at the ingredients. Okay, there's no mammal in this, but okay, how far do you go? And since there's no labeling with the FDA, there's no requirements to have anything. And oh, this product may contain trace mammal ingredients. FDA, if you're listening, that'd be great. But they don't. So once again, they only go so far without calling the manufacturing and talking to the people putting it together. We just don't know. But it really blew my mind that my practitioner called the pharmacy and at least took that initial step.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. I mean, I feel like most of them don't do that, or they leave it up to you to, talk to your pharmacist or what have you. So I love that. I'm gonna have to get the name of this practitioner after we after we finish.
So what does this mean when Nick, you said earlier you call the manufacturer and then you're like, hey, wait a second, what's your filtration process? What does that even mean, right? I mean, if I'm picking up that phone and I work for this company and you're saying what's your filtration process, I'm just curious, like at how deep does it go with your allergies with alpha gal? Because not only how you manufactured, but it's like your filtration process. Is there any kind of byproduct? It seems like this is really, really sensitive. So I just want to hear more about that.
So kind of backtracking, right around my anaphylaxis event, I was drinking a beer, and after that beer, basically I started breaking out at hives. I'm like, I didn't have lunch. Like, what's going on? Like, I all I had was a beer. Um, looking back after, and then I got my alpha gal diagnosis, and I started doing a deep dive into alpha gal and everything that's about, and came across alphagalinformation.org, which is, I think, the single best resource that anyone could ever have with alpha gal. I'm going to do a shout out to, I believe her name was Sharon.
Yep.
She put it together, and it's an absolutely fantastic website, because it's not only for people that are suffering from alpha gal, but there's enough citations in there that you could give that website to your doctor and they could learn things from it, because she took the time to do all the citations and do all of that work to make it that way. But beer, wine, they use filtering, clarifying agents, gelatin, and I can't think of the name right now, but there's also a dairy finishing agent that a lot of beer and wine manufacturers use in their products. And it can send us into a reaction. Water, some RO filters, some kitchen filters, bottled water, they use bone charcoal in the filters. And there's no way that, if you look at the label, they're not going to label that. So it's pretty difficult to once again navigate. So that manufacturer, I call it, say, okay, you got, water in your product. How are you filtering that water? Oh, we're using this. All right. Well, what is the filtering agent? It's, X, Y, and Z. Okay. What's your next stage filter? Oh, it's X, Y, and Z. Okay. Do you have another stage? And you have to ask all these questions because, oh, our filter is this. Okay. That's just the first filter. What about the next three? Um, yeah, it's a hard process to figure out.
Yeah, I mean, these are things that I frankly have never thought about, right? And I think most of us haven't until you have to, like the case you're in, right? So, I mean, you mentioned a bone charcoal filter, right? So when it comes to that, does that mean that that filter itself is contaminating the water and therefore it's going to trigger a reaction when you consume whatever that is that was filtered with that water that you're now consuming?
Yes, absolutely. So the bone charcoal is, ground up or I guess roasted mammal bones that are ground up and then put into a filter cartridge. So it could be the filter cartridge on your fridge, and you have to call the manufacturer to, when you go to replace the fridge filter, to make sure it doesn't have bone char in it.
Yeah, I do want to give a shout out to alphagalinformation.org. I think, is that what it is, guys? Am I saying it right? Okay. Because Candace, you put that on to us about a year or two ago when we first met, and we recommend that website to everybody. It's really a good website about the testing. It has the most comprehensive information out there as far as Alpha Gal is concerned. So we're going to link to that in the show notes of this podcast as well. But the other thing I want to ask your opinion on, Nick, is I mean, we see articles all the time about now genetically modified food products where they're taking the alpha gal protein out of it to make AGS safe meat for people to eat that have alpha gal syndrome. I mean, what are your personal thoughts on that?
Well, I did try this. So I got a pork delivery from a company called Revivicor. They are genetically modifying pigs for organ transplants and humans. And they'll process and send out for free to alpha gal patients pork products. Um, Now I got my delivery and dove right in. I was super pumped about it. I mean, I was so excited. I was like, I've never really seen you excited, lately. I was like, yeah, it's like, bacon, you know. How do you not get excited? Um, and then I tried it, and I was actually underwhelmed. I mean, it was a weird sensation. I was off of, all mammal products for like a year and a half at that point, and after eating it, I was like, I don't really miss this. Um, and then I think it was the MCAS reaction to some of the cured products. So some of the ham, sausage, and bacon, I would get kind of itchy from that. And I think it was just an MCAS reaction. Actually spoke to the Revivicor company. They called me after having that, after saying I had that reaction, and spoke to them for like 2 hours, and they were very receptive of it and trying to work on fixing whatever it is. I was blown away at that a company was taking that much care in their product. But yeah, once again, I was so underwhelmed by eating pork again that I don't miss it. I mean, I appreciate what they're doing, and for those people that do miss it, I think it's a huge benefit to them. But yeah, I was not one of those.
So I just want to circle back to the hormone therapy. You said you did some testosterone injections, and the intent was to help with the fatigue. Did that? It sounds like it had some minimal impact, but not much. So can you speak to what brought you to doing those, hormone replacement therapies that you did? And looking back, is it something that you think is helpful for people in the Lyme community?
I think so. So well, it's almost too much information, but at the start of my illness on the onset in 2010, I mean, the fatigue and sex drive just plummeted. And to be in my mid to low 30s for that to happen is, I mean, it shouldn't have. But those things, a little bit of the fatigue and the sex drive has improved greatly with the testosterone. And it's just with the fatigue to day-to-day life. I mean, I think the testosterone has helped. I mean, my doctor, the Lyme literate doctor, says, typically if your hormones aren't in balance, basically your immune system isn't can't respond in the way it should. So if we get the hormones to where they should be, then your immune system should help fight whatever it is that's going on and should help you improve as we move forward. So I think it was a great, one of the early steps. And yeah, I think as long as it helps me a little bit, then I'm willing to keep on going.
You mentioned earlier that you started the Cowden Protocol. So what made you and your doctor pivot away from DesBio and LDN and Japanse Knotweed and go to the Cowden Protocol? And did you have more success with the Cowden Protocol than you think you did with DesBio?
So it's a little too early to tell. I think I've been on the Cowden for 3 weeks. So it's super early. But yeah, it was basically, I feel like with the DesBio, I went through the whole protocol and I didn't feel a whole lot of improvement. So basically it was my doctor's decision to try something different. Okay, well, that might have worked a little bit. Let's pivot and try something else. And I am fortunate that he is very anti, here's some antibiotics and go. And because I hear all the horror stories, and I was on antibiotics most of my childhood, so I kind of fear for all, going back down that road with my stomach issues. I mean, who knows how much that played in a factor with all this. So I'll keep trying all these different herbals and see if we can make some more improvements as I continue with those.
Yeah, I do wonder, the antibiotics you were on pretty chronically as a child, did they impact your gut microbiome, which made you more susceptible to chronic tick-borne illness rather than more mild tick-borne illness you had as a kid, right? That's something that I can't help but think about. And the follow-up question I want to ask you is, we know from your questionnaire that you filled out for this podcast that you talked about Ehlers-Danlos syndrome as well, and that being a problem in your journey. So if you could just speak to that, because that's a very common implication in the Lyme community, and I don't think it's spoken about enough.
Yeah, so one of one of my symptoms that just was unexplainable by Lyme or any tick-borne disease was my loose joints. So as I got older and with the kids, don't exercise quite as often, I started having a lot of joint issues, subluxations. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Basically, it's a mild dislocation. And yeah, anytime I would like take a knee to just resting your weight on your knee, my knee joint would slip and grind. It would actually pop, and it was really bad. But most of my large joints will do some form of that, and it's super painful. Had one knee surgery. I have 2 tears in both my knees and the cartilage again, and yeah, so went through the diagnostic testing for that with my Lyme literate doctor, and searching for answers, and basically there's a scoring sheet on, I think it's the Biden score, and scored high enough on that to get a diagnosis for Ehlers-Danlos as well. And spoke to one of the doctors there, so I needed to talk to a different doctor to get the diagnosis. And basically, it's like there seems to be a very high link between Lyme disease and the Ehlers-Danlos, and he hypothesized about having those loose joints and having basically an easier time for the Lyme bacteria to thrive in the joints. I don't think there's any evidence on that, but I think it's it makes sense in my mind at least. So yeah, it definitely once again was, I guess, reassuring and I can't think of the word, but
Yeah,
validating.
I agree.
Hearing that.
We've had so many people on this podcast tell us that they're hypermobile, or they say I have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, or I have, heads, right? You call it whatever you want to call it. But in the end, I say, are you bendy? Are you bendable? Right? That's a very simple way to ask the question. Were you like bendable your whole life? And do you think are you hypermobile? What does that mean? And most people in the chronic Lyme community answer yes. Not all, but many do. And I think there's definitely a correlation there. We've had doctors, we've had patients hypothesize, we've had other people come on and get very defensive and say it's a genetic disorder. It's not related to Lyme disease, Matt. And I think it's important to note that so many of these things are separate in a way, but together collectively they cause more serious illness. Just like we said, alpha gal is a separate syndrome, which I don't like the word syndrome because it implies it's mental health and it implies that it's not a real thing. But to me, alpha gal syndrome is real. It's an allergy to a protein that we get from a tick bite. And that allergy is brought on later on in life because of a tick bite. And now we can no longer eat these foods and we become uber sensitive. And it's not just I can't eat steak, right? That's the other thing I want to highlight. Alpha gal syndrome is it's not just I can't eat a juicy hamburger or a juicy steak. It's so much worse. And I think you described that really well, Nick, as far as the human sensitivities, the ability to not be able to take certain medicines, the bone charcoal filters. I mean, these things are wild things that you have to worry about that people never associate with alpha gal syndrome from a tick bite. But beyond all that, I just think that we need to highlight these things can live separately, meaning somebody can have just Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. But when you have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a genetic disorder in some cases, depending on the type and the subtype, collectively with Lyme, it makes us way more sick, which is why the chronic community has that in common, in my opinion, right? So that's an important note to not trigger certain people that are listening to this podcast into thinking that we're diminishing these other conditions like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome as just being a minor piece of Lyme. It is independent. But I want to highlight one of the other things that I learned from you again, or reinforce, I should say, which is later on in life, you said you were getting bit by ticks so much that you invested in a chicken, and the backyard chickens, I should say chickens plural, the backyard chickens significantly reduced the amount of ticks in your yard, and you were bit less because of it.
Yeah. So our last house in Tallahassee seemed like it was just infested with ticks in the backyard. Manicured yard, not a whole lot of bushes. We put up a fence to keep the deers out. And we had a couple fruit trees, nothing out of the ordinary. Didn't seem like a tick haven. I think of tick haven would be in the woods, a lot of brush, a lot of dead leaves on the ground, things like that. But that was a well manicured yard, and go from the backyard to where the kids would play on the trampoline, and I'd pick up 3 ticks basically every time I'd walk out there, and it was unreal. So we had the yard professionally treated, didn't make a difference. I think we had them out 2 or 3 different times, treated it ourselves, trying some, oils, essential oils and things like that, didn't make much of a difference. And some of my coworkers were talking about their chickens and that they ate anything that moved. And so I went down the Google rabbit hole and I was like, do chickens, eat ticks? Sure enough, they do. I was like, that's it. I'm buying chickens. So our HOA at the time, it was in our bylaws that we couldn't have them. Like, well, we'll just see how long we can get away with it. So we put some chickens in the backyard, and we started out. We bought a dozen chicks, and we ended up giving away a lot of them. We kept 3 in a small little chicken coop that we could kind of hide in our backyard and behind the fence where the neighbors wouldn't see. And yeah, they did a great job of absolutely eating every tick out there. I mean, I don't think we got a single tick when we had the chickens, and we just let them free roam in the backyard, our fenced-in backyards, clipped their wings so they couldn't jump the fence. And it was, we actually got some relief from that. And I was like blown away that one, how many little insects that they would eat, and 2, free eggs. So how can you beat that? Vegetarian fed too, which sometimes we got to worry about that.
So I do want to ask, because I know now that we have kind of gone through most of your journey. You're 37 today. You have 2 children. You're married. Now, what are your thoughts as far as the possibility of passing along some of these conditions to your children? Because this is a really serious topic that many people have strong opinions about. And I'm curious if you discussed this with your doctor at all, or if you've thought about it. Were you actively infected around the time, your children were born? And if that's something that you thought about or had them tested or done anything like that?
Thought crosses my mind a lot, especially with my oldest, because like myself, he is a tick magnet. My youngest and my wife they don't really affect them that much. They could be in the same area, and my oldest pick up 3 ticks, and I will pick up, the same amount of ticks as my oldest. Um, but I do worry about that all the time, and we really need to get him a hygienics testing, and make sure uh, that he doesn't suffer from any of this. But like you stated it, I don't know if there's any studies that I know, maternally there could be, there is a possibility to transfer that, but paternally I haven't seen anything that might suggest that. And but I still worry about that a lot because of some of his symptoms, some things that I see going on with him. Um, yeah, I definitely worry about that.
Yeah, and I think it's a really hard conversation because, to your point, is it possible that that was a childbirth, passed on during birth, or is it something that you're just living in a tick endemic community and he's been bitten and possibly infected, right? And I think that's where the testing comes into play, and possibly a clinical diagnosis like you had in your case of Lyme, and possibly using some natural tools as you're using to help combat Lyme, because some of these natural tools are really good for your general health regardless, and can also be used to address the Lyme disease. So I think it's something it's healthy to think about, but also something that we can stress out and become obsessed with either, right? And I think your approach, Nick, is a really healthy approach to being concerned, but also not letting it, ruin your life or impact the life of your child, and his ability to live a happy, healthy life and be able to do things and not live in a bubble as well. So I think that's there's balance, like with everything there. So if I had to ask you, looking back on your journey, if you had to provide our listeners with one or several low cost or no cost solutions to address Lyme and or alpha gal syndrome, what would they be?
Probably diet, hydration, and sleep. Those are the 3 big things that help me out, and they don't cost hardly anything. Alpha gal diet's expensive, absolutely. But if you don't have alpha gal Lyme disease, changing your diet up, um, hydration, I think that made a huge improvement. Before my diagnosis, I was drinking just a ton of water because it's the only thing that made me feel better. And the sleep aspect of it, get as much sleep as you can. Let your body repair and recover.
What is an alpha gal diet, right? Because now you mentioned the word alpha gal diet. You said it's pretty expensive, but it's worth it. What does that look like for you?
Uh, Very repetitive. Um, I think that's the best way to put it. Um, because you kind of pick your brands, it's safe, and you always reach for those same brands out there. But yeah, it's basically a lot of vegetables, a lot of fruits. Rice is a very safe thing. Um, and yeah, I try not to experiment unless I'm going to be around the house. But it's a lot of experimentation with different brands and different products, to see if it works for you. Whether it's MCAS, AGS, nothing, not one person is going to be the same. So what works for Candace might not work for me. And the sensitivity of alpha gal on top of that. Some people can tolerate dairy, and a lot of us can't. So there is no one specific alpha gal diet other than no, red meat, no, beef, pork, goat, sheep. Outside of that, it varies a lot. based upon their sensitivity and their, I guess, MCAS and everything else that's going on with them. But yeah, really just no beef, pork, beef, camel, you name it, we can't have it. But a lot of fish, chicken, and turkey. Emu is one of the great things that I found is a beef substitute. Tastes just like beef, and fortunately, I live like 45 minutes from one of the largest emu farms in the nation, down in just south of us in Greensboro.
So Nick, what's on the horizon for you? You mentioned you're a couple of weeks into the Cowden Protocol. What are you planning for the future? And give us an assessment as to where your health is at now, because not only from a food sensitivity standpoint and a reaction of a alpha-gal syndrome standpoint, but also your chronic Lyme health, right? Because you were pretty banged up from Lyme disease as well.
Yeah, it just yeah, I kind of mentioned it before. It's like that roller coaster of healing or improvement, and it's just hopefully staying on that gradual path of improving. I mean, there's for years, I every time I got out of bed, it hurt to walk so bad. I just would be limping around the house for the first 30 minutes as my joints loosened up, so I could, get around. Um, but that has kind of subsided, and as long as I keep making gradual small improvements, that's all I can hope for. Yeah, de-stressing my life, that's a big thing. And just trying to make small gradual improvements every day.
Yeah, that's huge. And I want to encourage you, as one of the last things I say here, I want to encourage you to partner with Two Alpha Gals and Candace, because there aren't enough alpha gal syndrome awareness groups or people out there. And what Candace and Debbie are doing with Two Alpha Gals is huge. Partnering with some of the leaders in the space. You mentioned Dr. Commons and some others, and I know Candace knows them personally. She's met them. She's advocated, gone to research, seminars with them. And I think you would be a huge addition to this community, Nick, to help advocate, because we need more people doing this. We don't have enough in the Lyme community, but we have far more in the Lyme community than we do the Alpha Gal community. So I'm willing to give you up to the Alpha Gal community. This is where I'm teasing. I'm being silly, right? It's us against them. It's never that. We're all one big family, as you can tell, because we love Candace and the entire Two Alpha Gals community. But we do need more people to help advocate and bring attention to alpha gal syndrome, because I just had somebody here on Long Island where alpha gal is huge come into work and share with me, knowing about Tick Boot Camp, knowing about my experience, telling me that he got diagnosed with alpha gal after quite a long time of having crazy food allergic reactions and not knowing anything about it. And it's here on Long Island where it's really prominent. So we need more voices. Nick, you have a really good story to share with people to help them and to raise awareness. So I want to encourage you guys to continue on in this advocacy together and continue to build a community, because Dr. Rolls, when we first started, told us, when Rich and I first interviewed him, I think it was episode 8 of our podcast, that the grassroots efforts are what is going to make change in this world. And we've seen it happen over the last 5 years. These grassroots efforts and these communities coming together and working together is how we've been able to make some of the change we've made in this community. So please continue on, Nick, with your advocacy. And I want to thank you for joining our Tick Boot Camp podcast. Candace, I want to thank you for coming and co-hosting, because this was a really powerful discussion about alpha gal and Lyme together. And I don't think we've ever had such a deep conversation about the two in one patient before. So thank you both. And we look forward to seeing all you're going to do together.